God at work. And we clearly see him at work today in this story, don't we? When you think about God at work, what do you think of? Do you think of mountains rising out of the ocean? Or do you think about huge storms and lightning crashing and thundering? Or maybe solar systems being created as galaxies collide? Or do you maybe think about the more subtle ways he creates? New babies being born, or fields of flowers blooming in the spring, or sunsets that are spectacular. Well, we certainly see him today creating in dramatic events. He calls Moses to lead the Hebrew people out of captivity into this new life. And these events are really remarkable. I mean, Moses describes these plagues to Pharaoh, and then God does them. Moses says, hey, he is going to kill your firstborn. And then God allows this to happen. The Red Sea becomes a hindrance in getting out of Egypt, and God parts it. And then they're led by this pillar of fire and fed by manna and quail. And clearly the power of God is seen here as he is at work. Clearly we see him caring for his people, liberating his people, taking them under his wing, and bringing them to a place where they can be with him. But this is not the whole story, is it? Because somewhere around 1450 this happens. But it was around 400 years earlier that Joseph and his family settled in Egypt. And there's a lot that happened in those 400 years. The Hebrew people started out as privileged and prosperous farmers. But after all these years, their king and their culture has forgotten them. The history was rewritten. These great deeds of Joseph become meaningless. And they are isolated from the Egyptians, because the Egyptians did not associate with shepherds, and the Israelites were shepherds, and so there was no intermarrying or cross-culture between those. So Pharaoh looks out at this people and says, wow, they have become a threat. So what's happening? This ragtag group that had been saved by God and preserved from famine 400 years earlier was placed there, and it seems like they were forgotten. They were ignored, and they've fallen into miserable slavery by these cruel pagan masters. Why does God just seem to let this happen? Is that how God works? Is sometimes God just indifferent to what's going on? You know what a deist is? Anybody know what a deist is? You've heard that term, a deist. A deist is somebody who believes there is a God, and he's like a great watchmaker. And he creates this very complicated watch, and he winds it up, and then he sets it to ticking. And then he goes and does other stuff. Thomas Jefferson was a deist. A lot of our founding fathers were deists. And they weren't very impressed with this God. Jefferson said of him, he's a cruel, vindictive, capricious, and unjust God. I kind of see how you might look at these Israelites saved and then let to live in slavery. Is that how God operates? Does he do amazing things like save Joseph and his family and then tune out for a while and then come back and do some more amazing things? And is that what we see in today's biblical account? God in and out of the story. Is that what we're looking at? Because if that's what you see, you're missing something big. We're missing how God is active in our lives always. And how he is part of us always. Because when God speaks his plans, he does them. And he told Abraham, I'm going to rescue you, and then for 400 years, your descendants will be strangers in a country that's not their own. And they will be enslaved and mistreated there. And that's what happened. And then God goes on to say, I will take you as my own people, and I will be your God. And that's what happens. Because his people labor in solitude for generations and appear to be abandoned, but God is deliberately and intentionally setting the stage for their future. Just look at a couple of things we can see that are obvious. There are two midwives in this story. You've read the story. There are two midwives whose job it is to just help women deliver babies. And they're just doing their job. They deliver Moses. And God is working through these two obedient women to build his nation. We see God at work in the families that these midwives hand the babies into. These families are communities. He's given instructions on how to be a family. And these families are where these children are raised to become healthy adults who create their own families. God is quietly at work, working through these families to build his community. God told Abraham that the number of people blessed by him would be greater than the number of stars that Abraham could see. Remember how many people came down with Jacob and Joseph's family 400 years earlier? Remember how many there were? There were about 70 of them. You know how many there are today? As Pharaoh looks out and sees his nation? About 3.5 million. God has done what he said he would do. Pharaoh looks out and he says, I fear this nation. He uses that word. God said, I will build you, Abraham, into a nation. Quietly, consistently, God was working to do exactly what he said. It's not hard to think that he might be uninvolved and indifferent. But he is working through the fabric of people's day-to-day lives to work out his plans. We look around today, and it's not too hard to think, is God like distracted? Is he like maybe not really kind of engaged here? Is he not really present? Because we got a lot of stuff going on in our world, don't we? I mean, hurricanes and tragedies like that, those are things that befall us all the time. But we got this whole thing with Christians. There are more Christians that were killed in the 20th century than there were in all the previous centuries combined. We have a whole culture that has clearly decided that Christian values really are not, godly values are really not to be valued. We have a church that, instead of being united as Jesus calls us to be, you know how many denominations there are just in this country? 33,000. 33,000 different denominations. We see a lot of evidence that king and culture don't care for what God has to say. And it's easy to wonder, is he here? Is he working? But the answer is yeah. He really is. He is building his nation, sometimes quietly. He is keeping his covenant. It's not always real clear when that's happening. But he is working quietly in the background to make that happen. And you know it. You know it because you all have seen it. I look at the people who work in the kitchen on Wednesday night to prepare the food so we can have Bible study. God is working through them. I look at Paul, who shows up at everything that ever happens on this campus to make certain it works. Because God is working through him to make things happen. Okay. Just bought a car from Gary. Gary takes care of me. He's making certain his pastor has somewhere something to drive to get around town. God works through that vocation of providing transportation to serve people. He works through you guys to do that. He works through each of us where we are. Not in the obvious places as pastors or as, we'll say, Lutheran school teachers or musicians. I mean, he does that. But he works through our vocations, the jobs we have, just taking care of patients or people that need to buy cars or animals that feed us. He just works through our circumstances, and we can either serve ourselves with those or we can serve the people that he puts in front of us, because that is how he quietly takes care of the world, working through us. He could be sending out pillars of fire. He could be parting huge seas. He could be doing these big dramatic things. But evidently that's not what's needed right now. He's choosing to work quietly and simply. And his plans are moving forward. He is at work. And we all see it in our lives when we look. And so we watch. And we wait. We wait for the next enslaving power that comes to power. We look for the next burning bush. We look for the next unsuspecting, unexpected hero. But God is working out that plan. Because he has a plan, and he has a script for how that plan is going to work out. And he has a story, and your name is in that story. Yours is in that story. Your very name is there. Remember Pharaoh? What was Pharaoh's name? You know? Brad? Chad?
Don't know his name. Never heard it.
Yeah, you never heard his name because Pharaoh was not a godly man. Pharaoh could care less about Yahweh. And God let him be a king and let him exercise all his important power. And his name is never mentioned anywhere. You don't even know his name. Historians think they might, but they really don't. But you know whose name they do know? You know those two midwives who worked day in and day out to obediently do the job that God had put in front of them, who cared about the people that he cared about, who brought new life into the world and handed them to those families so they could be raised into a nation. Those two midwives, we know their names. And they're in Scripture. Their names are Shipporah and Puah. God had plans for them, and he honored them for just doing their work. Their names are forever enshrined in his story. He has plans for you as well. He has plans to be at work through you, with you, and for you. When you think of God at work, what do you think of? Violent storms, or spectacular sunsets, or new babies coming into the world? I suggest you add something else to that list too. What are you doing? Are you serving yourself and your little world? Are you open to God being the power that causes you to serve your place in the world? Because if you are open to that, God is at work through and in you. He may be at work quietly, or he may become more dramatic, but either way, he has plans to be in this world, to move his story forward, and to make you an important part of it. That is the God that comes to you today. In Jesus' name, amen.